Welcome to Aspen Ignites, Conversations to Build a Better World, a series from the Aspen Institute that brings together thoughtful people with diverse backgrounds and points of view. In this episode, Eric Liu, founder of the Citizenship and American Identity program at the Aspen Institute and CEO of Citizen University, discusses democracy and civics with journalist and author Joanne Lipman.
Okay, so I'm delighted to be here today with Eric Liu to talk about the role of civics and democracy and your work on both. And maybe we can start by you could tell me a little bit about what is the relationship between those two things, civics and democracy.
Great question. I think it's worth defining both terms a little bit. When we think about democracy in an American context, it is about this system we have of participatory self-government, right? And civics is the body of work that is teaching us how, in fact, to govern ourselves and how, in fact, we shall live together in a diverse community, right? And so part of civics is about the mechanics of what you think about when you think about how a bill becomes a law and what we were supposed to have been taught in middle school and so forth. But there's a part of civics as well that's beyond the formal institutions of elections and policymaking that is just about how, in a society that's premised on freedom and civic equality, we actually deal with each other and how we behave in public and hold a community together. That's, to me, the bigger definition of civics.
So I wonder, do you see that there's been an issue? Have we seen a degradation? Do we see people not understanding civics as much as they used to? And is there something we can do about that if that's the case?
Yes, 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 and yes. I think in our work at Citizen University, we have this simple conception of citizenship, which, when we talk about citizenship, first of all, I don't mean in the documentation status, U.S. passport holding legal sense. I mean this broader ethical conception of being a member of the body, right? A contributor to community. And civics is the art and the skill of being that contributor to community. Well, we define citizenship in this simple equation, which is power plus character equals citizenship. That if you want to live like a citizen in a useful way, you have to both be fluent in power and understand who decides things, how that came to be, what's changeable, how you would change things, what the sources of power are, money, ideas, people, social norms, state action. But you've got to couple that fluency in power with some sense of a moral, ethical core. Otherwise, you're just learning not citizenship, but sociopathy, right? And that character is not just individual virtue and perseverance and grit and so forth. It's character in the collective, right? The values of service and reciprocity and mutuality and stewardship that are, again, about living in a community. I would say that, in our lifetime, so much of the material reality of the United States as we become more economically unequal and wealth and power and voice have concentrated into fewer and fewer hands, our democracy has been under strain. And people are recognizing that too few people have too much of the power and are spending too much time justifying it in a way that is making everyone else feel left out and cut out. And that's been leading to all of these bottom-up eruptions of civic power. And so the through line that connects, Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party and Bernie Sanders and the Trump movement and, all these things that seem to be from different political parties are the same thing. A system that is no longer delivering on a promise of inclusion, participation, and delivering benefits to all in a way that respects the voice of all, but is feeling more and more like a rigged game. And now people are pushing back.
So now you have articulated that problem so well. We should bottle that, honestly. But now let's talk about some solutions.
Yes.
So what are some strategies that you would recommend? And perhaps we can then get into some strategies that people who are watching can bring into their own lives and communities.
So I would put the strategies into two buckets, or two categories that actually are in a cyclical relationship with each other. One is about institutions and what you might call structure. Policy change, legal change, changing the rules of elections, of campaign finance, things like that. And the other is culture, right? The norms, the values, the habits, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what's okay, right? And those two things are always in relationship. When you have a culture, a civic culture that is selfish, short-sighted, hyper-individualistic, super-materialistic, has no historical memory, well, you're going to get a set of institutions that are rigged, unresponsive, and so forth. And In turn, when you have institutions that are rigged, unresponsive, unrepresentative, you get a culture that becomes that much more cynical, checked out, and so forth. So, on the structure side, there are all kinds of things that run the gamut from ranked choice voting, so that we don't just have most of the people in a close election feeling that they were completely left out and that they truly lost in a zero-sum way, right? Ranked choice voting allows, multi-member districts in legislative races, right, where you could actually distribute and circulate power in a different way. Citizen assemblies, so that people would have voice in policymaking ahead of the smoke-filled rooms where the deals get cut and the bills get written, right? Even with things like the Supreme Court, which is, as we're speaking here, very much on people's minds and in the news, term limits for the Supreme Court, so that that institution not only can refresh the voice and the people that are in it, but can sustain legitimacy by not feeling stale and stuck and out of touch with the times and the majority of the people, right? So those are structure changes. But I think on the culture side, there's stuff that from your life in journalism and media and storytelling. What are ways in which we can rekindle local journalism, right? Projects that are like City Bureau in Chicago that are actually trying to train everyday citizens to be what they call documenters. They don't have to be full-blown, Wall Street Journal or, USA Today kind of reporters, but they're people who can actually walk through their community and actually capture stories, trends, danger signs that are happening that might not yet make the news or might just get lost on social media, right? So citizen journalism is one thing. A culture of commitment of the kind that national service promotes. If we could not only grow AmeriCorps, but actually create an expectation in the country where all young people would do some form of either civilian or military service, that would be a huge culture shift, right? At Citizen University, we have this program called Civic Saturdays, which are like a civic equivalent to a faith gathering. It's not church or synagogue or mosque, but on purpose it has the arc and the flow of that to invite people into a space of shared meaning making about what do we do here in Tulsa or in Tallahassee or in Tacoma to change the culture of our place. How do we do this in a way that doesn't feel like a business meeting or a politician's meeting, but has a ritual feel of invitation of let's together take a little responsibility with a little bit of reality and a little bit of joy to remember what we're doing here together. So there are all kinds of things on both the structure and culture side that we can do, but they all begin with doing what we do here first, which is committing to show up in the first place. Like not sitting back and saying, man, things are on fire, that's a bummer, right? But actually to recognize the ways in which we have not only the right, but the responsibility to show up and be a co-author of how this thing could change.
So how do you help people? Because when I listen to you, every element in structure and culture that you mentioned, there are people you could spend your entire life on.
Yep.
I know a law professor who spends all of his time on ranked choice voting.
Yep.
Can we get ranked choice voting? People like myself spend all of our time on how do we fix the media model for local journalism,
Yep.
right? So how do you prioritize? How should people who are listening, how do you don't want people to say, oh my gosh, that's so much.
Yeah.
I can't even start.
Totally.
How do you start?
So I have this super important two-word answer to that. Pick anything. I'm serious. Like pick something, some issue, some mode of engagement on that issue, right? And commit yourself for 3, 6, 9, 12 months to go deep on that issue, right? And it could be ranked choice voting. It could be local journalism. It could be, criminal justice reform. It could be civic tech, whatever it is. Just say, I'm going to go deep here, not only so that you get subject matter expertise in a thing that you care about or is relevant to your life, but so that you can actually build muscle of joining, learning, encountering people who would disagree with you on the right solutions to the issue, and figuring out, in a word, how to do civics and democracy, right? It's the rebuilding of that associational muscle and kind of joint action muscle that only comes if you sustain on an issue for a little while, right? After that 6, 9 months, whatever it is, you may decide, you know what? I'm glad I got this muscle, but that's not my issue. I'm not going to go work on climate emergency or other issues like that, right? Great, wonderful. But that overwhelm that you're describing of, everything is on fire, where do I start?
Yes.
My magic answer really is pick something, right? And the corollary answer to that too is join a club or start a club, right? Just the joining of anything. It helps kind of reduce, first of all, that anxiety of overwhelm, but also loneliness and isolation. that comes when you're just doom scrolling or watching the thing that we can't stop watching, which is the outrage machines on cable news and so forth, with for our side, and the joining with other people, again, in some form of collective action. It doesn't even have to be civic. It could be a gardening club. It could be a neighborhood. No, it could be a book club. Is something that we Americans have lost, certainly in our lifetimes, in a way that we're paying the piper now as a country for the atrophying of that both that muscle in us, but also of the body politic itself.
So we have very little time left, but I just want to pick up on one thing you said for a final question, which is you talked about the outrage machine. And I think this is top of mind for so many of us. So how would you recommend that people engage in terms of helping to understand, to cut through the misinformation, the malinformation, and to fight back against it?
So I think there's two or three habits that we can all cultivate, and I actually emphasize the word habit, right? Because so much of the way in which we've become both consumer and creator of outrage in our civic culture right now is a matter of habituation, which our social media platforms are quite aware of. They're very good at figuring out what we will get habituated to. They will algorithmically kind of steer us toward things that habituate us. And so I think we've got to be A, conscious of habit, and then B, able to replace that habit with something else, right? So number one, when you were leading nationwide journalism organizations, you were not just reading your own news outlet. You were reading widely, right? Not only other competitor outlets, but you're reading ideas and opinions from across the ideological spectrum. We've all got to kind of kindle that habit in ourselves, right? My own Twitter feed, I'm reading people like I cannot abide them in some level, completely disagree with them, but it's super important to know what they're saying, to know what they're referencing, to know the things that they're reading, and to kind of be able to get that bigger picture in mind. So number one, diversify your media diet, right? Number two, I think continue all the time. There is this kind of job in journalism called fact checker, right? Different papers have different columnists, but we've all got to kind of build our own habit of fact checking. Like you read something, you take it, and you got to ask, is that true? Does that seem right? And then actually be able to do in some curated way a little bit of fact checking. And there are still, even though authority has disappeared in our world, in our life, there are still people you can turn to that are not just a search engine and that are not just a YouTube algorithm that'll feed compounding things in one direction. Public librarians still exist and wish to serve us in this way. They are trained, actually, right, to help steer us toward, hey, if you're questioning this claim, here's a bunch of kind of competing evidence around that claim. If you're interested in this thing, here's something that someone wrote that says this thing is the worst thing that ever happened, right? They're still trusted arbiters and authorities, and that's public librarians, reference librarians, whatever else. Public libraries, both the people there, but also the institution, are super necessary. So that second habit of seek out, whether it's librarians or some other, help in checking facts. But then I think the third one is more of an internal ethical, moral habit that we really try to teach at Citizen University, which is do not give in to righteous certitude. This has to be kind of your own kind of choice, right? All the incentives in our culture right now reward righteous certitude, punish gray area, like, I'm not sure about that. You got to be sure, you got to act like you're sure. If you express doubt, you might be punished, canceled, so on and so forth. And I think we've got to rebuild that habit in ourselves of, the famous jurist Learned Hand once said, the true spirit of liberty is the spirit that is not too sure it is right, right? And I think we need to rekindle that true spirit of liberty right now in an age where we suffer from an excess of people being too sure.
Yeah, that's a beautiful sentiment, and I love your concept that part of what this is all about is learning to listen to others, yes, including others who you may not agree with,
yes,
but
especially then, right?
Right, so that's the way that we can actually have a true democracy.
Yes. I want to ask you, I mean, given your really rich career in journalism, well, number one, just on the question you posed to me about disinformation and the dangers of, filter bubbles and echo chambers, what have you learned about how to answer your own question? How do you actually break out of silos and make sure you yourself don't succumb to either one-track thinking or become exploitable by mis and disinformation.
Yeah, so like you, Eric, I have a very, very, very wide media diet of all different perspectives, of all different kinds of sources, all different platforms, so that you, first of all, you have a broader perspective. But I think a really, really important issue for journalists, honestly, is this ability to listen and to not come up with your idea first and then try and report it later, right? We all have to have much more of an open mind. And I do think one of the biggest issues, and I recommend this in every newsroom I've been in, I recommend this to all journalists, including my students who I teach at Yale, which is I think that a lot of the issues that we run into today are because we are so polarized as a country and politicians are so polarized, we have to avoid being sucked into being on one side or the other side. And that doesn't mean trying to make a middle road and saying on the one hand, on the other hand. What it does mean is we are constantly in a search for truth, but also what it means is every story is not just about the left side said this and the right side said this. The biggest issue I have when I read news articles is whatever the topic is, it tends to go immediately into the argument over the topic, but what it doesn't do is explain what is the heart of the topic. So for instance, the debt ceiling. Almost every debt ceiling article, news piece that you would ever see was all about the fight over the debt ceiling. If you were to ask the average person on the street, what is the debt ceiling, they probably either wouldn't know or they would tell you it's about spending in the future. When in fact, as we know, the debt ceiling is simply about paying your bills, like paying your credit card bills, money you have already spent that you already agreed to spend, right? These are very simple concepts, but we're not explaining them in our journalism. So I think that will actually go a very, very long way to helping people understand the landscape.
So before we run out of time, one other thing I want to put to you that kind of connects the dots between what we've both been talking about here is to pick up on what you said about listening. Okay, so the art of listening, we talk a lot at Citizen University about the kind of civic skill of listening, of both silencing your own kind of prior opinions and mindsets, of being attuned to full body listening, right? Not just what's said, but what's not said, and so on and so forth. But you literally could teach a course, and maybe this is the subject of some of your work at Yale, on the art of listening from a professional, repertorial standpoint. What are some things that the kind of for everyday civic life that you would want to share from what you've learned about journalistic listening?
Yes, one of the things that I learned that I found to be very effective in real life, not just journalistically, when you meet someone who has an absolutely oppositional point of view towards yours, and you talk about certitude, beware of righteous certitude. That is so true, because when you meet someone with the absolute opposite point of view, rather than trying to change their mind, which you will not, I find it very effective to just drill down and say, can you explain to me why you believe that? And if you know that the facts are wrong, you can say, well, 99% of doctors have said that that's incorrect. Can you explain to me why you believe that you are in the right and they are in the wrong? And not being confrontational or ugly in any way, but just I want to understand you. And I have found that this is a very effective way of trying to understand where people are coming from. And also, by the way, in real life, of trying to find some common ground with people who you might otherwise disagree with.
I love that. That is not only about a sense of empathy and curiosity, but ultimately what's driving that is a desire to understand.
Absolutely. And it makes for much, much better journalism. I do think that, if we look back at some of the journalistic mistakes, I think that particularly the national media was, of which I am part, so I don't excuse myself at all, I think was too quick to dismiss the Tea Party, for example, and not understand that there were real intelligent people who were having serious issues with the government that were not being addressed. And the same thing with the rise of Trump before he was first elected. I don't think there was a thorough understanding of the discontent and the reason why, and there was too much there was too much quickness to kind of dismiss some of these people who had real concerns.
Well, the thought I'll just close with that, of course, connects some of the dots between those of us who work on civics and citizenship and reimagining civics and citizenship, and people like you who are leading the kind of reimagining of what media and journalism can mean in this time, is this issue that you and I have talked a lot about, which is trust.
Yes.
And and sometimes the question is posed, well, how can we make our institutions more trustworthy? But I think the thing that we've both learned in our work is that for those of us who are in institutions and positions to try to earn trust, the perhaps counterintuitive answer is for us to trust people more, right? And people will sense when they're being talked down to. People will sense when someone is walking in with a solution or a pre-baked way to do stuff. And people will also sense when they're truly being heard and truly being understood, right? And I think that's true whether in a media context or just in a community building civic context where you're trying to invite people across lines of difference to make a place, a town, a community, one that is more whole and more healed. So I'm so glad to start this conversation on camera. We'll continue it off camera, but so glad to be doing this.
Thank you so much. This is such a great conversation and to be continued,
Absolutely.
definitely. Thank you.